Welcome back, everyone. So I thought, for the interest of posterity and just to keep the video series up to date with some things that are going on the ground, I'd take a look back at one of the videos I did back in August and update you to the situations that are going on in either country. The thing is that the situation has changed a lot in both of the nations involved here, and so I'll go into what I think's changed and why those changes have come about. So if you know anything about the United Kingdom and its situation currently, it's pretty sporadic. England and Wales tend to do their own thing as separate from Scotland and Northern Ireland, but in terms of COVID, the national governments have chosen their own ways of going about handling the virus, and so it's led to a very sporadic nature. The sporadic nature of policy between them has been very different. You can see that when looking back, the Scots and the Welsh are much harsher on it than the English came to be. But we can also take note in the fact that the English gave up on their COVID restrictions fairly quickly. And this is what I found most surprising when coming back. I did say that it was a strict policy, but it wasn't centrally government enforced. In fact, the strict policy was created by the social structure enforcing it. So instead of the strong central government putting in place COVID measures that kept people stuck in their houses, there was actually more of a social pressure created by the media and its lackeys. England was led into a tyranny of its own choice, or at least of a choice of a small elite minority that were able to contain the narrative. The difference is that, as we've seen, once the English state has given up with that line of thinking, and the media lackeys they themselves, even though you take a look at some of the BBC's articles, they're still trying to push COVID as being this horrendously dangerous thing. Once the central government gave up on it, we've reached a situation where COVID is a thing that's been forgotten about. A lot of people wear a mask out of courtesy, or they have some personal fear about the virus, but there's no restrictions in any public places. Nothing will be enforced into how people wear masks or whether you need to sanitize your hands, and we're beginning to see that public places are opening up more. There's no restrictions on social distancing, and those ridiculous plastic edifices that I hated in the last video have been taken away. They're not being replaced. Once they get dirty or disgusting, they're being thrown away. So, as you can see, with this socially enforced kind of totalitarian, socially enforced version of COVID restrictions, once the public gives up on enforcing it, once the vast majority of the public gives up on enforcing it, the whole regime collapses. There's no support behind it anymore. You get the odd mask wearer, yes. You get the odd loon who says that COVID is still going to be the end of the world. But by and large, the government has given up on vaccinating everyone, and that's the situation for the future. We've even reached a point where if you call in sick to work, claiming that you have a COVID sickness, your job cannot turn you away anymore. So you could go into work with COVID, whereas before that would have been a total social pariah situation. If you ever turned up to work with COVID, your co-workers would have hated you. And this is where I'm going to turn to the situation that's playing itself out in China. You see, the difference is with a regime where the central government takes the stance on COVID, and then the local governments have to play out that stance. We can see that the restrictions were relaxed to begin with, but have begun to get stricter and stricter as time goes on. The problem really stems from the fact that the situation in China is as such that local governments are beholden to the central government. The central government will set a standard that it expects to be maintained, and then the local governments have to play that out in force. As we've seen in places like Shanghai, they're willing to play it out to make sure that they don't go against central government mandates. They're willing to lock down the 20 plus, in fact it's way more than that, it's 27 million people that live in Shanghai and its metropolitan districts. They're willing to lock them down really hard in in the line of trying to keep this zero COVID regime going. What this really is the tyranny of central government expectations playing itself out. Xi Jinping expects something to be done, that mandate is set, and everyone else better pick up after it, even at the expense of the local economy. And believe me, that's going to hurt us more than it will China, as we'll see in the knock-on effects in the next few months. The real situation that's playing out here is one of total containment, sticking to a party line, really. It's difficult in Asian culture because they cannot lose face on this matter. China has said that there will be a zero COVID toleration on Chinese soil, and so they must play that out regardless of its consequences. I have seen this situation many a times, but I didn't expect it as strict as it has been played out in the last few months. There's been many stories that have blown this out of public proportion, claiming that the government will be heartless in the face of social backlash. That is simply untrue. See, the Chinese government will face backlash on a social level, and it will have to change things to keep things in line. All these stories that you'll have heard of Chinese guards beating home pets to death, of children being separated from their parents in camps, these stories that you hear lambasted in places like the BBC News and even on lotuseaters.com, these stories will only last for the moment that they're posted on Weibo or WeChat, because the Chinese government doesn't like bad PR. It will see these videos and change the policies almost overnight. Whether or not that will ease the situation in Shanghai is seen to behold. I can't predict the future with the Chinese regime, because I'll be honest with you, I didn't see this harsh lockdown coming. I would, however, consider it a logical conclusion from the way that the Chinese government conducts itself in these kind of crises. One thing I would like to backlash against is that watching one of the Lotus Eaters videos, they started trying to lead comparatives between the Chinese government of the 1960s and 70s and the Chinese government of today. Oh, the communists, they're all the same, right? The Chinese communists have been the same all the time. They call themselves the same, they have the same symbols, they still respect Mao. This is the same party, just in a different time. This is simply not true. The current Chinese government has a completely different way of thinking to the Chinese government in the 1960s. The Chinese government of today is far more beholden to the people than it was in the past, and that's simply down to one thing: technology. You can put out something on the internet today that will be seen by millions and millions of Chinese people who will backlash against their local governments and the central government, and the policy will be forced to change. In Asia, face matters more than anything. If you're seen to be doing bad, you will have to change that situation quickly or face the consequences of it. These small videos will cause a big backlash and big changes. Just wait for it. I bet you that in the coming weeks, things will change radically because of the bad PR from this. Whether or not that will be in favour of the West, I have no idea. Obviously, I would prepare for the knock-on effects of this Shanghai lockdown. It's the largest port in the world. Most goods that come from China and from the Far East pass through that port, and so there will be significant effects for manufacturing bases in the West and in other parts of the world. I hope to return to the situation where the Chinese government looks first and foremost to the health and prosperity of its own people. This is the duty of a government that claims to represent and be in the interests of a section of people. And I still believe wholeheartedly that even after these lockdowns, even after the poor PR that's come out of this, that the Chinese government still has more the interests of its people at heart than that of Western governments. That's all for this one. See you on the next one. 再见.